Welcome back to Unpacking School, where teachers try to explain trends in education to anyone curious enough to listen. I'm your host, Andrew Nussbaum, submitting this video as a final project for INTE 5360, Critical Digital Pedagogy. And it doesn't get more critical than this next topic, ungrading. Today we'll be unpacking what this term means, where so-called traditional grades come from, and why more and more educators are challenging the assumption that high-stakes grading, or potentially any grading, actually benefits student learning at all. Today we're talking about ungrading, which is defined by Susan Bloom as a spectrum or umbrella of teaching practices that emphasize student experiences and growth over assessment. This might seem like a radical or naive approach for educators, but Bloom prefers to flip the question. Not why ungrade, but rather why grade? What is grading supposed to do, and does it actually accomplish its goals? First, a brief history lesson. While it is easy to assume that grades have been around as long as education, Bloom and her colleagues Jeffrey Shinsky and Kimberly Tanner demonstrate this is actually untrue. Aside from the Imperial Chinese Civil Service exam, Bloom traces the first grades to the Mechanical Engineering Department at Cambridge University in 1792. Supposedly, the chair of the department gave marks to individual examination questions taken by his students. It is worth noting that at the time, Cambridge's great rival Oxford tended to downplay student rankings, and many European universities even gave pass-fail examinations with the option to retake them until passing. At the same time in America, early universities such as Yale, Harvard, and the University of Michigan were experimenting with a wide variety of grading scales, including a 100-point scale. Yale may have been the first to begin assigning students credit for individual classes on a 4-point scale, but rather than our current system, which often encourages students to focus on grades, at Yale, these marks were written in code and hidden from students. The letter grade system popular in the 20th century has been traced to Mount Holyoke College in the 1880s, and soon spread to most other colleges, then trickled down to secondary and finally primary grades. Originally, Holyoke's system had been from A to E, which corresponded to 75% or lower, but in 1898 they added an F for fail. This became the standard through the 1930s when E was dropped, possibly to have fewer categories, or possibly to avoid confusion that it stood for excellent. And thus we acquired the famous A through F system so many of us are so familiar with. Not written in stone, but just 140 years old. Even though the 5-point letter scale grew in popularity, it's important to note that as late as 1971, more than 30% of primary and secondary schools in the U.S. did not use letter grades. There are many contemporary schools that follow progressive or constructivist approaches, which either employ no grades or do not emphasize them, from Montessori to Waldorf to various unaffiliated independent schools. Bloom names a dozen top colleges or universities that either have no grades, don't automatically share grades with students, or give students the option to take classes pass-fail. Similarly, Bloom notes that of the top 160 medical schools in 2017, only a fifth still use numerical or letter grades. The rest have opted for some variation of pass-fail in large part because they have not found any meaningful connection between basic science grades and students' qualifications as physicians upon graduation. Ultimately, what's most important isn't how widespread grading currently is, but more the recognition that the assumption that it is universal or required is a myth. So, grades are not inherent to education, but rather part of our modern industrialized approach to schooling. In other words, grades are a choice. As Bloom says, the power in recognizing that grades are an invention is the awareness that this means that we as teachers have the potential to uninvent them, whether within a classroom or a wider school community. Now that we feel a little empowered knowing that grades are a relatively new invention, let's examine the why behind ungrading. What are the current problems in education that ungrading is trying to fix? Where does current assessment often fall short? And why have some educators come to see grades as not only not beneficial to students or learning, but, as Jesse Stommel puts it, the biggest and most insidious obstacle to education? Grades require an assumption of uniformity, that students are both starting and going to the same places, and have the same academic experiences during a term. If that isn't true, then grading may not be a useful way to assess student learning. Grades don't provide enough information to students. If a grade's purpose is to convey meaningful feedback or areas for growth, they usually fail. Grades often encourage students to focus on product over process and on a final score versus learning and improving. Rather than continuing to develop a skill, many will often see the grade as the end of a conversation, not the start of one. If feedback is offered alongside the grade, it is routinely ignored by students, a phenomenon documented by Ruth Butler as early as the 1980s, and which has been repeatedly confirmed in follow-up research. In Bloom's medical school example, she mentions that one reason they have reduced or eliminated focuses on grades is because they have been, quote, plagued by high rates of suicide. We know grades are one of the top causes of stress for students across age groups. In a 2018 Pew poll of American teenagers about stress, 61% said getting good grades caused them the most stress, double the amount of the next two highest categories, looking good and fitting in. If we as teachers, through our practice, have the ability to reduce this incredible anxiety, don't we have an obligation to at least investigate it? Finally, with that high anxiety and the feeling that everything is riding on every grade at every time, it is not surprising that some students often experiment with cheating, particularly with assignments that are testing rote knowledge, or where it is apparent their work is not being very thoroughly evaluated. As frustrating as this may be for educators, we need to recognize that students are responding to incentives they have been told are important: approval of family and teachers, a successful job and career, financial stability, social prestige, etc. Combining a lack of intrinsic motivation with a high-pressure environment, it's quite natural that so many students' focuses become not on actual learning, but rather, as Bloom puts it, mastering the game of school, potentially at the cost of academic honesty. I can personally remember one time in high school and another in college where I felt so much pressure to want to have a perfect score, even though I was at schools that de-emphasized grades, that I took advantage of an unproctored moment and snuck a peek at my study guide. I can still remember both of those questions and the undeserved answers I submitted. In my own case, I had internalized so much pressure to succeed that leaving the answers blank didn't feel like an acceptable option. Given all we know about student stress and the real challenges with traditional grading, it is becoming more difficult to rationalize or make the affirmative case that grades are particularly beneficial to students at all, aside from appeasing other high-stress actors in their lives, such as teachers, college counselors, tutors, peers, or family. If we see part of our work as teachers as both supporting our students intellectually with meaningful instruction and feedback, and emotionally by doing what we can within our classrooms to minimize harm caused by high-stakes grading, then we might very naturally find ourselves drawn to explore the world of ungrading, or at least de-emphasizing grades. As Alfie Kohn puts it in the epigraph to Bloom's book Ungrading, you do what you can within the confines of the current structure, trying to minimize its harm. You also work with others to try to change that structure, conscious that nothing dramatic may happen for a very long time. Now we're going to take a look at the what and dig into some strategies for ungrading. When first contemplating ungrading, some teachers may feel initial frustration or resentment that it won't work for their particular circumstance. Yes, ungrading might work for young kids where scores aren't attached to anything tangible, but what about when schools start tracking GPAs? Conversely, students in high school or college may be able to handle some level of trust and self-assessment, but are middle schoolers really ready for that? And what about so-called hard sciences like math and physics? What does ungrading look like there? First, Bloom notes in her book, and specifically chooses teachers and examples, that demonstrate that ungrading can work successfully across a range of grade levels, disciplines, and subject matter, from elementary to middle to high school to college, from language arts or art to STEM. While there may be individual challenges depending on teaching circumstances, the overwhelming message I've encountered from all the literature and podcasts I've spent time reading and listening to is that anyone feeling drawn to the idea of ungrading should definitely explore it. As we discuss strategies, think about some potentially easy ways to integrate some of these into your current practice or grading system. As always, remixing is not only encouraged, in teaching, it's required. Here are 10 top strategies to try, compiled from Susan Bloom, Jesse Stommel, and Canadian educators Rachel Johnson and Katie Atwell, hosts of the EduGals podcast. Grade-free zones. Periods during a course where no grades are assigned, for instance within the first month of school. Minimal grading, such as pass, fail, or complete or incomplete. This can be a relatively low-stakes way to ease your class into ungrading. Afterwards, consider debriefing with your students. How does a pass, fail, or complete, incomplete grade on an assignment feel compared to traditional grading? Does it make them approach the assignment or the class differently? Why might that be? Free gifts. Activities that don't need to be assessed because the experience is the assessment. A recent example from my own classroom is a cave art activity where every student chose a message to communicate and painted a basic picture on a piece of construction paper representing their cave. I chose not to assess this activity because the primary goal was to let students put themselves in the position of an early human artist. Since they all successfully completed the project, no assessment was needed. Self-reflection. This can be done in a variety of media, from podcasting to videos to written submissions, potentially in a blog setting where posts are public and students respond to each other, to face-to-face conversations with the teacher in a conference. In some cases, student self-reflections may include a section where they must assign themselves a grade and then defend it. Many college ungrading practitioners, including Bloom and Stommel, use this as one of their main tools for assigning end-of-term grades. Peer-to-peer grading and feedback. With scaffolding and coaching, this can be a valuable tool to promote metacognition and self-awareness, as well as communication and empathy skills. It's important to think about how to intentionally model this to set students up for success. Revision. Students receive feedback, and through one or more revision steps, improve their work, until receiving some final grade or feedback. This has the benefit of emphasizing process over product, and also providing students with a concrete example of building their skill over time. Conferences. This is one of Bloom's favorite ungrading practices. She meets with students in the beginning, middle, and end of the terms, and has them discuss self-identified areas for growth and then reflect on their progress. The final meeting is often where the self-grading conversation will happen. Portfolios. Whether physical or digital, an archive of student work, ideally self-selected, is invaluable for both evaluating strengths and challenges as well as monitoring improvement. Portfolios can be excellent tools for teaching students to accurately assess themselves and to notice their growth, and work well in conjunction with conferences, self-reflections, and revision. Immediate self-graded assessments. Here, students complete a test and then grade themselves and justify their reasoning to the teacher. This can be very helpful in determining if there was any widespread confusion about a question or topic, and help students get practice explaining their thinking and considering multiple points of view. Rubrics. Rubrics are a bit of a debated point in the ungrading world. Alfie Kohn sees them as fruit of the poisonous grading tree, particularly ones using a 4 or 5 point scale that easily translates to A to F, and describes them as, quote, an attempt to deny the subjectivity of human judgment. If students' focus remains on how well they are performing rather than how engaged they are with a task, then it doesn't matter whether someone is meeting expectations or getting a B. The same misdirected attention is going to product over process and outcome over feedback. On the other hand, many ungraders currently teaching in a classroom setting, like Bloom and the EduGals, find rubrics quite helpful, especially as a way of giving consistent attention and feedback to emerging skills. Stommel likes having students design their own rubrics, turning the creation of the criteria and the reflection on assessment into its own metacognitive exercise. Ultimately, like everything else on this list, rubrics are tools to be used and adapted by teachers. So if you find that yours are just replicating the same issues as traditional grades, either change them or consider retiring them. As Bloom says, the guiding principle of ungrading is on feedback and improvement, rather than a quick grade that shuts down learning. Or, as Stommel puts it, grades will never be fair, so we must start by trusting students, and realize fairness is not a good excuse for a lack of compassion. How to talk about ungrading. Last, we come to the how. Specifically, how to communicate about ungrading to a variety of audiences and get buy-in for it. As Johnson and Atwell point out on their EduGals podcast, it's critical to have support from administrators, and part of getting there is starting conversations about grading in your school or classroom and areas you feel are either lacking or where you'd like to have freedom to experiment. From there, the discussion needs to broaden to the parent community, because again, being able to clearly explain your reasoning and your alternatives are critical to convincing people to even consider something new or different. They need to know the motivations behind your proposed changes and how you plan to hold students accountable, as well as how you will practically implement and explain this in the classroom. The EduGals recommend framing the discussions around the idea of offering feedback to students. The goal isn't to get out of grading, but rather to explore different options for making feedback more meaningful and productive. One suggestion is to consider incorporating mastery-based grading, which focuses on skill progression rather than student deficits. Mastery-based grading can be used alongside an ungrading approach, in which some work is not graded and other work is scored using a mastery-based model. Jesse Stommel, who like Bloom teaches university students and therefore has a slightly different set of stakeholders to answer to, is more direct in his ungrading rationale, arguing that grades are inherently unfair as well as thorns in the side of critical pedagogy. Following a model from Paulo Freire, Stommel instead pushes for a power-sharing model, where students become co-creators of their education and not just passive recipients. Part of authentic criticality of examining power within his own class is helping students interrogate who grades are for and what questions and assumptions go into the grade. Stommel promotes critical and intrinsic self-assessment, where assessment isn't something that's being done to students, it's a part of the learning process and they're actively involved with it. In the Pedagogy podcast, Stommel addresses some common questions that come up when discussing ungrading in higher education, particularly around the ideas of rigor, authenticity, and fairness. First, academic rigor is generally poorly defined, and Stommel argues there is no reason to correlate it with high-stakes educational hierarchy. Authenticity is similarly murky. If learning and teaching are subjective, how can assessment be objective? Stommel argues that the idea of objectivity is often one way education avoids the moral implications of assessment. At least by de-emphasizing quantitative data, the focus can be on student accomplishment and growth rather than defending the grade. What about fairness? Should two students be able to negotiate the same mark for turning in different levels of work? Similar to Bloom, here Stommel starts by questioning first assumptions. Why should the emphasis be on ranking and comparing students to each other, rather than evaluating individual progress and having personal, meaningful dialogues with instructors? Why perpetuate the idea that learning is a zero-sum game and that students' success is based on doing better than other people? When we challenge or reconstruct grading, what we're really doing is applying consistency to who and what we're prioritizing in our classroom, the learning experience and growth of the student during that period, not thinking ahead to future hypothetical evaluators or employers. Even at the college level, Stommel points out that grade point averages are not very significant in a job marketability context. Rather, he argues that having skills, particularly critical thinking and communication skills, are much more likely to help students seeking employment in a tight job market. All the more so for those of us teaching high schoolers or below. Conclusion and a call to action. So let's review. Today we've learned that the 5-point grading system was started at a single college and then quickly spread, kudzu style, to envelop most of American education. We've talked about why grades often don't help students, and in many cases actively harm them. We've examined how more and more schools in higher education are moving away from traditional grades, in part to address those same issues we see with younger students. And we've reviewed strategies for alternative forms of assessment, as well as some solid rationales to defend them, should you be asked to. I'll leave you with the two most empowering ideas to come out of this project for me. First, that grades are not immutable, but should be seen as flexible and adaptable to teacher priorities and needs. If you have the freedom to shift your teaching practice away from high-stakes grading and towards more authentic forms of assessment, consider this permission to start exploring those practices, or at least start considering Stommel's point about the moral implications of grading. Second, the reminder that ungrading is a spectrum, and that it is foundationally about genuine conversations between students and teachers about progress, and designed to reduce harm often caused by high-stakes grading. You don't have to completely eliminate your current grading system overnight, or at all. Any step towards normalizing meaningful feedback without strings, and empowering your students to critically examine their grades will be a positive move forward. Good luck out there in education world, and keep being awesome. This is Andrew Nussbaum, at Unpacking School.